Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the National Podcast, normally recorded in our studio at the Bishopbriggs Media Centre, currently recorded from our volunteers' homes. To keep in touch with us, use our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, which are all at Q and Review. That's CUEANDREVIEW. Or get in touch via information@qandreview.com. That's information@CUEANDREVIEW.com. Please like and share our podcasts and give us any constructive feedback.
You're listening to The National as published on Friday the 1st of April 2022. Comment. Joanna Cherry. Saying Scotland could do better if it had independence just isn't enough. If you watched Prime Minister's Questions this week, you will have seen several of my SNP colleagues ask very pertinent questions. Carol Monaghan on why Westminster is punishing Scotland's renewable sector with exorbitant grid connection charges, Chris Stevens on why the UK government has cut food waste funding to zero, and Patricia Gibson on the Tories' abandonment of their manifesto promise on the triple lock on pensions. What you won't have seen or heard is anything resembling a pertinent answer. This is a recurring problem at House of Commons question times, but it's worse at PMQs because the non-answers are usually peppered with a good few lies. Fact-checking MPQs has become a full-time job. Having Boris Johnson as PM means that we have a moral void at the heart of British politics. It's not just that someone who lies and dissembles as a matter of course has been promoted to high office, it's that he continues there without any consequences for his actions. He should never have survived being found to have prorogued Parliament unlawfully. That he was not held accountable for such a shocking attack on our democracy shows there is something badly wrong with our system. That he went on to win an election does not cancel out what went before, but it has emboldened him, for as we all know, he has form. Before he became PM and misled the Queen, Parliament and the courts about the reasons for the prorogation, he had lost his job as a journalist on the Times for making up quotes and as a shadow minister for lying about an extramarital affair. As editor of The Spectator, he lied about the victims of the Hillsborough disaster. His casual attitude towards facts as Foreign Secretary added years to Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's sentence in Iran, and of course his lies about the savings to be made about leaving the EU helped deliver Brexit, which is now having such a disastrous effect on the British economy. Boris Johnson's lies have destroyed lives, reputations and livelihoods. On Partygate, he insisted for weeks that no rules had been broken. An enterprising journalist at Business Insider has identified that his government said this on no fewer than 39 occasions. It's particularly significant that some of these occasions took place in the House of Commons. As Robert Peston said earlier this week, the fact that fines have been handed out now establishes beyond doubt that Number 10 was party central during the COVID lockdowns. So when the PM told the House of Commons that there were no parties and no rules were broken, he misled MPs. British Constitutional Convention dictates that if a minister does that knowingly, he or she should resign. Personally, I have no doubt he did so knowingly, because that is what he does, but there is no sign of him going. At the Liaison Committee this week, Pete Wishart suggested that if Johnson himself gets a fixed penalty notice, he will be toast. I am not so sure. We seem to be in a very different place from where we were just a few weeks ago, when everyone was obsessed with how many letters the 1922 committee had received. The war in Ukraine may have saved Johnson. The fact that so many Tory MPs chose to party on the very day that the first batch of Partygate fines were handed down tells you all you need to know about how seriously they are taking this situation now. If being PM at the time, when the people of Ukraine are suffering so grievously, has saved him, then it's a rich irony that on the one thing he could really do to help the Ukrainian people, he has so abysmally failed. Perhaps his most egregious lie this week was when he told one of his own Tory backbenchers that visas for Ukrainian refugees who want to take advantage of the sponsorship scheme are being processed at the rate of 1,000 a day and that 25,000 have already been issued. In fact, the UK has granted only 2,700 visas under the Homes for Ukraine scheme, and the remaining 22,800 visas have been issued to Ukrainians seeking to join relatives under the Ukraine Family Scheme. The rate of processing of the sponsorship scheme visas is, as any MP will tell you, grindingly slow. Some 28,300 applications have been submitted under the sponsorship scheme, but only 2,700 have been processed. The scheme opened on March the 14th. Did Johnson tell the truth when he said 1,000 are being processed each day? You do the math. Meanwhile, the Scottish Government stands ready to take more than our fair share of the refugees who want to come to the UK, but its hands are tied by the red tape of the Home Office and the dogged insistence on visas. Across Europe, other countries are taking in way more Ukrainians fleeing the war than the UK and not delaying matters with visa applications. Boris Johnson is bragging about schemes that are mere window dressing in comparison. It is immoral. Yet it is trite to say Scotland could do better than this with independence. Readers of this paper know that. What they want to hear is a plan and the policies that together will deliver independence and the reality of doing things differently to Johnson when it comes to the big moral and humanitarian challenges of our time. Saying there will be an IndyRef next year is not enough. As well as the answers to the hard questions which we all know will be asked about borders, currency, EU accession, etc. during a campaign proper, we also need to be proceeding with a policy agenda at Holyrood that prepares the ground for independence and demonstrating that in Scotland, even under devolution, we do things differently. Last week, when I wrote about how executive accountability at Holyrood could be improved, many of the readers who chose to leave comments seemed to think that this could wait for independence. I disagree. Doing things better than Westminster doesn't have to wait for independence. It should be an ongoing project. It's our Parliament, and if it too is failing to hold the executive to account properly, there are things we could do to improve it right now. We don't need to wait for independence. That Boris Johnson is beyond compare when it comes to evading responsibility for his actions does not mean that we too could not do better in our Parliament. This article was by Joanna Cherry. You're listening to The National as published on Friday the 1st of April 2022. Comment. Energy crisis. Tories are aware of rising poverty but don't care. By Maggie Chapman. Our recovery must tackle poverty and inequality rather than entrenching it. This will be a hard day for millions of households. From today, average energy bills will go up by an eye-watering 54%. It's a devastating increase that will decimate household budgets and plunge thousands of people into fuel poverty overnight. It's a move that has been decades in the making. Successive governments have cozied up to the fossil fuel lobby and viewed energy policy as something to enrich oil and gas companies rather than provide vital services that we all rely on. They have focused on private profits and fossil fuel exploration rather than investing in clean alternatives. There has been no shortage of warnings and missed opportunities. David Cameron visited the melting ice caps in the Arctic and presented himself as an environmentalist, but his decision to cut the green crap and slash funding for renewable energy initiatives added billions to energy bills. The impact has been hugely exacerbated by Downing Street's cosy relationships with oligarchs and Putin associates. This may have swelled Conservative Party coffers, but it has distorted our economy and left us far more dependent on fossil fuels and polluters. Far from levelling up, the Tories have served to increase inequality. The richest have seen their wealth soar, but millions of people have been punished. This has only intensified since Boris Johnson came to power, with research from the New Economic Foundation showing that the number of families living in poverty has increased by 300,000 over the last 2 years alone. It's vulnerable and marginalised communities who are being hit the hardest. The cruel benefit cap and policies like the bedroom tax have trapped thousands in poverty and destitution, with the universal credit cut alone taking over £1,000 a year from people who were already being stretched. None of this is an accident. The Tories are all too aware of the impact of their decisions. Their vision of the economy is one that works for big businesses and the rich. They know that millions of people are struggling, and they know about the misery that they are causing and the poverty they are imposing, but that hasn't stopped them. They just don't care. That poverty manifests itself in many ways, including poorer health, housing, and access to education. People who live in poverty are far more likely to experience poor physical and mental health and to work in low-paid jobs and live in cramped and overcrowded accommodation. But rather than addressing these issues and their causes, consecutive governments have chosen to point the finger and traded on hatred by scapegoating marginalised communities. Theresa May's hostile environment didn't come from nowhere. It was built on years of reactionary policies and a foundation of prejudice and inequality. It doesn't need to be like this. If our recovery is to be one that works for everyone, then our economy must do the same. That means taking a totally different approach. It means planning our policies around needs rather than multinational profits. It means curbing the influence of big business and addressing issues like poverty wages and poor working conditions. It means providing a voice for workers and supporting public services, sustainable jobs, and the green industries of the future. It means acting against exploitative companies like P&O that are running roughshod over workers' rights. The UK government has condemned P&O's decision to sack 800 workers without notice, but words are not enough. It has refused to take action against the company and has repeatedly demonised trade unions and refused to ban, fire and rehire. With Greens in government, we are taking big steps to build a fairer society. Through negotiations with the Scottish Government, we secured measures to mitigate the benefit cap and are increasing the Scottish Child's Payment by £15 a week, which will be worth an additional £780 a year for every eligible child. We are introducing a requirement on companies that receive public sector grants to pay at least the real living wage and give workers a voice, including through trade union representation. By 2032, we will deliver 110,000 affordable homes and invest an additional £50 million over the Parliament to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. We will complement this with the introduction of new rights and protections for tenants, including rent controls. These are big changes that will mitigate some of the damage being done by Westminster and build on important policies that have already been introduced, like free bus travel for young people and free school meals for primary school children. They will make significant inroads into tackling child poverty and help those most in need at a time when the UK government has abandoned them. However, as important as these changes are, they cannot be the extent of our vision or the height of our ambitions. The last 2 years have been harsh and painful for far too many. The economic policies being pursued by Downing Street left us badly prepared for the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, and skyrocketing energy costs. The society we rebuild must be better. We are at a crossroads, and this generation of politicians will be judged by how we recover and who that recovery works for. We will be judged by how we rise to the challenge and how we respond to the climate crisis. Every day I am contacted by people who are in desperate situations. It is these people I am in politics to help, not the oligarchs who want to buy our democracy or the energy companies who are celebrating record profits while their customers are suffering. I am very angry about the poverty and inequality that is at the heart of our economy and about the stress, anxiety and economic violence that is being inflicted by a cabinet full of millionaires. But I am also hopeful. We can deliver a different future. Our job must be to plan and then build an economy that works for everyone. This article was by Maggie Chapman.
This article is from The National, date 1st April 2022, from the Politics section. Free travel for Scotland's children this weekend as ScotRail returns to public ownership. By Craig Meechan. Up to 4 children will be able to travel for free on ScotRail trains with every adult this weekend as the rail franchise comes back into public ownership. To celebrate the transition, children will be able to ride the trains for free on Saturday and Sunday if accompanied by a fee-paying adult. On Friday, the franchise transfers from Dutch firm Abellio into public ownership. Abellio has been running ScotRail since 2015, but it has faced criticism over performance levels. Its contract has been brought to an end 3 years early, having been due to last until 2025. Transport Minister Jenny Gilroth said, bringing ScotRail passenger services under public control and ownership puts passengers and staff at the heart of Scotland's rail services. It's an historic occasion and one that marks a key milestone in our ambitious programme for government to support a greener, fairer Scotland. This is an opportunity to deliver a railway which is for the benefit of the people of Scotland and everyone who travels by rail, customers, staff and stakeholders, not shareholders. The national conversation that gets underway this spring will provide an opportunity for staff, passengers and communities to have their say in how we shape Scotland's railway and ScotRail in particular. To celebrate this transition under the banner It's Yours to Use, we're providing free travel on April 2nd and 3rd for up to 4 children with every fare-paying adult. We are encouraging everyone who can travel by rail this weekend to show our pride in Scotland's railway and our support for those who work hard to operate it on a daily basis. Timetables will remain the same as planned and train livery is not changing, though the word Abellio will be removed from signs and printed materials. A publicly owned company called ScotRail Trains Limited will operate train services, overseen by a public body called Scottish Rail Holdings. That article was by Craig Meehan. This article is from The National, date 1st April 2022, from the Culture section. Historic Scottish sites reopen this month. Our top 7 picks. By Anita Badani. Major Scottish sites of historical interest are set to open their doors to visitors once more this April. A 4,000-year-old cairn, the tower which inspired Sir Walter Scott, and the former home to Scottish engineer James Watt are among the historic sites that will be reopening across Scotland for the spring and summer. Historic Environment reopened over 70% of its estate last year. However, some of the sites had remained closed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Reopening these sites means the visitors will once again be able to take a peek behind the doors. Take a look below to see just some of the sites set to open their doors once more. Cairn Papal Hill. Lying in the Bathgate Hills, this Neolithic ceremonial site was a significant site for ceremonies and burials for at least 4,000 years. Its henge dates from about 3,800 BC. Visitors can stroll to the summit of the hill and take in awe-inspiring views across the Forth Valley. Reopening date, 1st April. Smailham Tower. Take a visit to the isolated tower house which inspired Sir Walter Scott. The 4-storey tower house remains roofed and floored. Over the border in Northumberland, visitors can spot Bamborough Castle from its battlements. Reopening date, 1st April. Spinney Palace. The largest surviving medieval bishop's house in Scotland, the Spinney Palace was residence to the bishops of Moray for 500 years. Royalty often used the palace as a guest house during their travels. Reopening date, 3rd April. Hermitage Castle. Known as the guardhouse of the bloodiest valley in Britain, this isolated castle, located in the midst of Scottish wilderness, is steeped in history and intrigue. The castle was targeted for 400 years for its role in controlling the Scottish Middlemarch. Reopening date, 19th April. Torfichan Preceptory. Founded by David I in the 1100s, this high tower and remains of the medieval headquarters of Scotland's Knights Hospitaller is rich in wonder. Here, pilgrims visiting the Holy Land were sheltered and protected. Reopening date, 19th April. Jarlshof Prehistoric and Norse Settlement. With over 4,000 years of human settlement to its name, Neolithic people first settled on this Shetland site around 2700 BC. It remained in use until AD 1600s. Visitors can see the Iron Age broch and wheelhouses at the site's location overlooking the West Foe of Somborough. Reopening date 21st April. Kinneil House. From occupying Romans to the Industrial Revolution, this house is steeped in 2,000 years of history. It is credited as the birthplace of the improved steam engine, Scots engineer James Watt, who developed his first engine here in the 1700s. Reopening date 24th April. That article was by Anita Badani. This article is from The National, date 4th April 2022, from the Politics section. Partygate. Former Ethics Chief Helen McNamara fined over scandal. By Angus Cochrane. The Tory government's former Ethics Chief has been fined by the Metropolitan Police for her involvement in the Partygate scandal. Helen McNamara, who used to be the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, is said to be among the first group of people to receive a fixed penalty notice from Scotland Yard as part of its investigation into alleged lockdown breaching parties in Downing Street and Whitehall. The Daily Telegraph reported that McNamara had received a £50 fine on Friday in connection with a leaving do held in the Cabinet Office on June 18, 2020, to mark the departure of a private secretary. Meanwhile, several reports suggest people have also received fines linked with a gathering that took place on the eve of the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral last year. These fixed penalty notices were among the initial round of 20 issued by the Metropolitan Police. McNamara was the Director General of Propriety and Ethics in the Cabinet Office from 2018 to 2020. The purpose of the role was to ensure the highest standards of propriety, integrity and governance within government. She was promoted to the post of Deputy Cabinet Secretary in March 2020 and later left government to work for the Premier League. The leaving do on 70 Whitehall on June 18, 2020 was reportedly held for Hannah Young, a former Home Affairs policy advisor who was taking up the post of Deputy Consul General in New York. There were said to be about 20 people present, with alcohol consumed. It was reported that advisors and civil servants gathered after work for two separate events on April 16, 2021, shortly after the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. One was for former Downing Street Director of Communications James Slack, now Deputy Editor of The Sun, and the second for a photographer, and they were later reported to have merged. Number 10 staff were said to have partied until the early hours of the morning in a 7-hour drinking session. Takeaway pizzas were reported to have been ordered in, and some of the revellers were said to have used a slide belonging to Johnson's son, Wilfred. The following day, the Queen sat alone, socially distanced from her family, as she said goodbye to her husband. Number 10 previously said an apology had been extended to Buckingham Palace. It has also been suggested by ITV News that Johnson will not be interviewed by the Metropolitan Police as part of their Partygate investigations. This is because the force is not interviewing those who have received questionnaires as part of the inquiries and could be potentially fined, the broadcaster said. Conservative MP Steve Brine on Sunday night called for transparency about who has been issued with fines. Speaking on BBC Radio 4's Westminster Hour, the MP for Winchester said they should just be honest about who's been tipped off with what and put it all out there and say, you know what, we've got this wrong or this person's got this fine, because these guys in the press, they won't focus on the issues of the local election. They'll scratch around and try and dig up all this stuff again. The Met is investigating 12 events, including as many as 6 that Johnson is said to have attended, and has sent out more than 100 questionnaires. The PM received his in February. ITV said the only officials being interviewed were witnesses, whose role is to help the police interpret questionnaires submitted by other people. The Met are not interviewing those who received questionnaires and are in the frame to be fined, it said. Number 10 has so far only promised to confirm if Johnson or Cabinet Secretary Simon Case are given a fixed penalty notice. The PM is not said to have attended either the June 18, 2020 gathering or the events on April 16, 2021. The Met declined to comment. The Cabinet Office also said it had nothing to add beyond pointing to a statement from Scotland Yard issued earlier this week. One Tory minister insisted on Monday morning that his boss should remain in place because the world has moved on. Welsh Secretary Simon Hart claimed the vast majority of voters in his constituency wanted Johnson to carry on. He told Sky News, "We all make judgments that we've had time to reflect on and wish we'd made differently. For me personally, I think the world has moved on a considerable distance. I trust the views of the people who elected me in saying, look, put this problem right, make sure you apologise. You acted inappropriately at the time. But the idea that every politician, or indeed every journalist for that matter, who makes a misjudgment along the way should automatically be sacked is not something I subscribe to." That article is by Angus Cochrane. This article is from The National, date 4th April 2022, from the News section. Ukraine accuses Russia of massacre as bodies found near Kiev. By Jane MacLeod. Ukrainian troops are finding brutalised bodies and widespread destruction in suburbs of the capital Kiev as Russian soldiers withdraw and Moscow focuses its attacks elsewhere. Associated Press journalists in Bucha, a small city northwest of Kiev, saw the bodies of at least 9 people in civilian clothes who appeared to have been killed at close range. At least 2 had their hands tied behind their backs. The reporters also saw 2 bodies wrapped in plastic, bound with tape, and thrown into a ditch. Authorities said they were documenting evidence as Ukraine's military reclaims territory and discovers indications of execution-style killings to add to their case for prosecuting Russian officials for war crimes. Around 400 bodies of civilians have been discovered so far, according to reports. Alexei Arestovich, an advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, said scores of civilians who had been killed were found on the streets of Bucha and Kiev suburbs of Irpin and Hostomel in what looked like a scene from a horror movie. Arestovich said some people were shot in the head and had their hands bound, and some bodies showed signs of torture, rape and burning. Kiev's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, said civilians were shot with joined hands and told German newspaper Bild that what happened in Bucha and other suburbs of Kiev can only be described as genocide. A day earlier, AP journalists witnessed Ukrainian soldiers removing at least 6 bodies from a street in Bucha with cables in case the Russians had booby-trapped corpses with explosives before their withdrawal. Local residents said the dead were civilians killed without provocation, a claim that could not be independently verified. Klitschko called on other nations immediately to end Russian gas imports, saying they were funding the invasion of Ukraine now in its 39th day. Not a penny should go to Russia anymore. That's blood money used to slaughter people. The gas and oil embargo must come immediately, he said. Charles Michel, President of the European Council, wrote on Twitter that he was shocked by the haunting images of atrocities committed by Russian army in the capital region. The EU and non-governmental organisations were assisting in the effort to preserve evidence of war crimes, according to Michel, who promised further EU sanctions against Russia. Yesterday morning, Russian forces launched an airstrike on the Black Sea port of Odessa in southern Ukraine, sending up clouds of dark smoke that veiled parts of the city. The Russian military said the targets were an oil processing plant and fuel depots around what is Ukraine's largest port and home to its navy. Odessa City Council said Ukraine's air defence shot down some missiles before they hit the city. Ukrainian military spokesman Vladyslav Narzov said there were no casualties from the attack. The smaller port of Mariupol remained cut off from the rest of the country as Russian and Ukrainian soldiers fought for control of the besieged city. Around 100,000 civilians, less than a quarter of the pre-war population of 430,000, are believed to be trapped there with little or no food, water, fuel and medicine. The International Committee of the Red Cross hoped a team of 9 staffers and 3 vehicles it sent on to help evacuate residents would reach Mariupol yesterday, but said the situation on the ground is volatile and subject to rapid changes. Ukrainian authorities said Russia agreed days ago to allow safe passage from the city, which has been the site of some of the worst attacks and greatest suffering, but similar agreements have broken down repeatedly under continued shelling. Mariupol is the mostly Russian-speaking Donbass region. Its capture would create an unbroken land corridor from Russia to Crimea, which Moscow seized from Ukraine in 2014. With Mariupol squarely in Russia's sights, Ukraine insisted it had gained ground elsewhere, with territory north of Kiev regained from departing Russian troops. But the regional governor in Kharkiv said yesterday that Russian artillery and tanks performed over 20 strikes on Ukraine's second largest city and its outskirts in the country's northeast over the past day. Governor Ole Sinyhubov said a missile strike on the city of Lozovo wounded 4 people and that Russian tanks bombarded a hospital in the town of Balaklia. That article was by Jane MacLeod.
From the National, Monday the 4th of April 2022, from the comments section, a refreshing plan to build trust and pull down barriers for women in sport. An opinion piece by Maureen McGonigal, sports columnist. Building a workforce that can cope with the needs of sport is important, and it is something that we have to tackle now. While many continue to increase their investment into women's sport, they have to realise this will increase the pressure on officials, administrators, judges, etc. So there is a necessity to invest, also to cope with future growth. We cannot insist on professional standards from our players without ensuring that the backup roles that are necessary to support these standards have also a robust recruitment process in place and are invested in. This statement is also relevant to those who work behind our screens, bringing sport to life in our homes, and I was very happy to join a group of people who debated this recently. It is spearheaded by Lucy Lake from QTV, an award-winning Scottish production company, delivered a brilliant event in partnership with FVG Europe Women, which is the first in-person community event for 2 years, and Glasgow was the venue. Their focus was exploring the Scottish skills shortage, and they were looking for solutions to help support the pressing need for more crew for sports broadcasters, and looking at how to increase diversity, particularly by welcoming more women into the profession. The panel on the night was amazing, and the plans in place to how to break down those old barriers of mistrust and work together was refreshing to hear. As always, when you have a female speaker who has broken down barriers very early on in her career, working in a male-dominated environment, you can hear some harrowing tales. But the chink of hope was that coming through the conversation is a very welcome right step forward. This is the start of a very important conversation, one that won't be put in a box and labelled with a tick. And that was a comment piece by Maureen McGonigal. From the National, Monday the 4th of April 2022, from the comments section. A time when Britain welcomed those fleeing for their lives. By Neil Asterson. With a gush of steam into the winter night, the refugee train drew into a country railway station in North Wales. We were lining up the platform, a welcome party with villagers who had spent frantic days cleaning and decorating empty houses. A red, white and green Hungarian flag came out of the train window first, a hole in its centre where the communist emblem had been cut out. Then the doors opened and shabby, exhausted men and women began to step down to the platform. The first thing I noticed was that some of them were still wearing blood-stained bandages. There was a reason for that. They had been brought straight to Britain from the battlefields as Russian troops crushed the remnants of the Great Hungarian Uprising of 1956. Nobody had made them wait for visas, or carried out security checks on their identity, or demanded any pre-entry paperwork. The British government of the day, ironically the very same government which had carried out the crime of the Suez invasion a few weeks before, had ordered all immigration rules to be suspended for the Hungarian refugees. Selwyn Lloyd, the Foreign Secretary, spoke in the House of Commons as the first contingent arrived. Perhaps our most important contribution has been to allow 115,000 refugees to enter this country without preliminary examination. This is a greater number than any other country, except Austria, has been able to take. The frontier with neutral Austria was the most obvious escape route from Hungary, although there were minefields and Russian patrols to contend with. Once across, the fugitives were gathered into temporary camps. And there were British volunteers from non-government organisations, the WVS, the British Red Cross, the Refugee Council, were waiting. Of the Home Office, with today's stalls in Lviv or Calais telling desperate families they have not brought the right forms and must go to another country to apply for a visa, there was no trace. Instead, as one 1956 arrival remembered, there was a woman in a smart Red Cross uniform shouting down the hut, "All those who want to come to Britain, line behind me over here." Then it was straight into the buses, straight to the airfield, and into this weird, unheated but friendly country a couple of hours later. Another Hungarian, then a boy, recalled how he was spoken to by a British volunteer in Austria. "Listen, young man, if you want to come to Britain, we'll give you pocket money and a job." Something over 20,000 would eventually arrive from Hungary, but more than half of them made clear that they'd hoped to move on, almost all heading for Canada or the United States, where they had relatives in the large Hungarian communities. In contrast to the displaced Ukrainians today, well over half the refugees were male, with very few children. This was because the fighting in Hungary was almost over, and young men who looked as if they might have fought in the uprising were being dragged before firing squads by the thousand. A very few arrivals were crooks. The revolution had opened the jails to free political prisoners, but others also took the chance to walk. Of those who chose to stay in the UK, a surprising number turned out to be ambitious and successful intellectuals. Universities rushed to offer them bursaries, and many would galvanise British higher education. Today, it's a different story. The British government has authorised more than 20,000 visas to Ukrainians with relatives in the UK, but the actual issue of the visas is so slow that some families have returned to Ukraine in despair. For the rest, only 2,700 visas has been issued by the end of March under the Homes for Ukraine scheme, in spite of the enormous response of would-be sponsors and the Scottish Government's decision to bypass the delay by acting as a collective sponsor. Meanwhile, in the cold and darkness of Kiev cellars or on the floors of Warsaw churches, Ukrainian women with children stare at page after page of bewildering identity-proving questions in English. Since 1956, Britain, and not just the British state, has grown uglier. Under attack from shocked critics, the Home Office sulks. After all, it is only doing what has become its default duty, to keep foreigners out, especially poor ones. All recent experiences show that the hostile environment policy, though officially repealed, has lodged permanently in British government culture. That's unfair to the thousands eager to share their homes with Ukrainians who have lost everything. But, as another 1956 survivor muses, people were incredibly friendly then, and journalism was very different. The press was very positive about migrants. I think it must be horrible now. And that article is by Neil Ashterson. From the National, Monday the 4th of April 2022, from the comment section, £50 is offensively small price to pay for disregard PM showed to the public, by Stephen Payton. What is a crime that results in a fine, but a crime that is legal for those with the money to pay for it? While people across Scotland and the rest of the UK struggled through the various lockdowns and restrictions of the COVID-19 pandemic for the sake of our friends and neighbours, our Westminster leaders seemingly party through the worst of it, and the Met Police have deemed it to be worthy of a fine that likely comes to less than the cost of Boris Johnson's breakfast this morning. £50 is the price the Met Police have set for having wheeled a fridge full of cheap booze into Downing Street while people attended loved ones' funerals over a Zoom call. For repeating to the cameras the government's message and staying indoors, alone and isolated, before retiring to a sunny garden for a cheeky glass of Pinot Grigio with friends. For brashly clapping in frontline workers, pushing themselves to exhaustion to save lives before wrapping some tinsel around their necks and joining in the planned festivities. £50 is an offensively small price to pay for the disregard shown to the people of Scotland and the rest of the UK, and the foul elitism of it all. Consistently, the police have been remarkably restrained when it comes to issuing fines to the Prime Minister's entourage. Something of a contrast compared to the threats issued to the organisers of a vigil for Sarah Everard in the wake of her murder at the hands of serving police officers. Warnings were issued of fines up to £10,000 for that particular crime, followed by the very real and notorious brutality used by police officers to break up the vigil when it went ahead without the organisers. Or for the case of Jessica Allen and Eliza Moore, who were initially fined £200 each without hesitation by the police while out on a walk near a reservoir, having been surrounded by officers who insisted that the hot drinks they were holding were not allowed as they were classed as a picnic. The Met Police have altogether been all too reticent to take lockdown breaches at the heart of government seriously, while utilising disproportionate means to enforce it elsewhere. Perhaps if the airy conversations in the garden of Number 10 had turned to the topic of police violence, they might have come down somewhat harder. This initial series of fixed penalty notices, and the anonymity attached to them, has more of an air of being seen to be doing something after being rightly pilloried for it, instead appearing to have repeatedly let Johnson and his fellow revellers in discretion slide. Though working in an environment alongside Rishi Sunak's £180 smart coffee cup and Boris Johnson's handcrafted £840 a gold wallpaper, I'm left asking how many pounds could be considered a punishment. Less than a slap in the wrist, more like getting your hair ruffled and called a bit of a scamp. Conversely, the sheer meaninglessness of a £50 fine in a place like Downing Street only draws attention to how something that could mean less than nothing behind the door of Number 10 would be enough to financially cripple any number of families trying to scrape through the current crisis being overseen by the Conservative government. Maybe those fines could go to funding those soon forgotten care staff who, thanks to Johnson's government, will now need to spend an average £50 a month on lateral flow tests to keep themselves and their patients safe while at work. I still don't particularly believe that Partygate will be the downfall of Boris Johnson. Besides the fact that Johnson has shown that he will never willingly hand back the power he has warmed it into his grasping hands, there is simply no real alternative at Westminster to motivate English voters into kicking out the Conservative Party, not with enough support to beat Westminster's archaic electoral system anyway. Though that doesn't mean it's clear sailing for Johnson either. In his giggling hand-waving around this issue, and the Met's apologetic shrug in response, both have fundamentally underestimated the strength of feeling over Partygate. People across the UK have made painful sacrifices over the past 2 years, only to discover that the Prime Minister, our supposed leader, was having a merry time indeed at her own expense, even if he still won't admit to any real misconduct. Last week, a Conservative MP was laughed at in Question Time for once again trying to defend Johnson's antics throughout the scandal, after claiming that the party's leader genuinely didn't believe there was wrongdoing. The worst part of this statement is that I believe this may be entirely true. It's wholly conceivable to me that Boris Johnson sees himself as so far above plebs like us that it was never even conceivable to him that the rules his government set would ever apply to the likes of him. And that only makes it worse. Johnson was back to dropping quips about Partygate at another dinner party for Conservative MPs just a few days ago, alongside crude jokes about transgender people. It wasn't so long ago that making jokes about Number 10's disinterest in following the lockdown rules it had set was a resigning offence vis-a-vis Allegra Stratton. Now the PM feels secure enough to crack out the gags once more, while families held a candlelight vigil outside for the loved ones they lost during the pandemic as Johnson made merry. Meanwhile, not even Sue Gray knows who has received a penalty notice in their inbox so far. Between the total lack of transparency and consequence alongside the jolly business as usual attitude, it is clear that Johnson and the institutions that protect him continue to view themselves as well above the rules that govern the rest of us, and that doesn't look to be changing any time soon. And that was a comment piece by Stephen Payton.
From The National, Tuesday the 5th of April 2022, from the sports section. Tiger Woods won't be at Augusta just to make up the numbers, by Nick Roger. Well, are you getting excited yet? By all forensic accounts, the world of golf will have to be strapped to a hospital gurney in a fraught attempt to restrain the hysterical thrashings and panting convulsions whipped up by the prospect of Tiger Woods playing in this week's Masters. Yes, Augusta National is calling again, and my goodness, what a giddy fankle we've worked ourselves into. I say we, but maybe you, yes, you, sitting there quite calmly with your cup of tea and saucer of custard creams, couldn't give two hoots about all this hoopla and hyperbole. Readers of the Herald have always been a canny, unruffled, measured lot, after all. Well, until they started poring over this ruddy page. The latest Tiger episode may be the most extraordinary. If he appears on the first tee on Thursday, the golfing gods will presumably link hands, the stars will align, the lightning will crackle, and everyone will drop to their knees and crawl around on all fours in a rapturous pandemonium of unbridled worship. I may be slightly exaggerating here, but you get the general idea. Just 14 months on from that devastating, life-threatening car crash which almost cost him his right leg, Woods is poised for his greatest comeback on the course where 25 years ago he won his first Masters title by 12 shots. You've got to admire his flair for the dramatic, haven't you? The other week, social media got itself in a right old pickle when Woods' name remained on the tournament's entry list. He couldn't, could he? A few days later, the internet went utterly delirious when a flight tracker followed the path of his private jet from Florida to Augusta, and news emerged that he was playing a practice round. Not since the Wright brothers first took flight has a plane attracted such point-and-gawp intrigue. That inter-thingamy-bob, meanwhile, has just about been welded back together after blowing a gasket amid the mouth-frothing mania. And now here we all are, still on tenterhooks, as the clock tick-tocks down, with the heightened theatrics of the counter on a bomb in a Bond film. Woods returned to Augusta National on Sunday and has embarked on a prolonged fitness test of a rebuilt leg over the steep, undulating and unforgiving terrain of this cherished golfing cathedral. You could say it's a stress rehearsal. Woods is also doing a press conference today which will no doubt prompt the kind of thunderous stampede you would get with a herd of migrating gnus on the Masai Mara. The rest of the Masters field, meanwhile, will be shunted so far into the sidelines they'll have to show the relevant lanyards to get back in. Someone like Rory McIlroy, who will once again be going for the career Grand Slam in a quest for a milestone that has become more of a hefty millstone with each passing year, will be delighted to float along under the radar. In a sense, it's a trifle depressing that the remorseless fixation with Woods roars on at a time when the global men's game has a vibrant mix of abundant young talent in its upper echelons. When it comes to generating hype, hope and hysteria, though, nobody does it quite like this 46-year-old who hasn't played a full-blown competitive event since the rescheduled Masters in November 2020. Tiger can't let go of golf, and golf can't let go of him either. According to those on the ground, it's so far so good for Woods. He seems to be moving and swinging well, and barring some major setback, he'll be striding to the tee on Thursday. Brace yourself then for blanket coverage of every blow, relentless torrents of analysis, and a tsunami of gushing genuflection. Nowhere on planet Golf does syrupy schmaltz and saccharine sentimentality quite like Augusta, but all that dewy-eyed, mawkish cooing will surely reach new heights this week, with the kind of sugary reverence that should come with a warning from the Food Standards Agency about the excessive consumption of sweet things. Wood has never mixed the cut at Augusta in 21 appearances as a professional. In addition to his 5 wins, the most recent coming in 2019, when we all thought that would be the pinnacle of his powers of recovery, Wood has 7 other top 5 finishes and a raft of top 10s. Augusta is one of his great hunting grounds. There is no way that Wood will want to be a ceremonial entrant, playing simply on the basis of being a past champion. He'll want to compete. With a leg bolted together with various rods and pins, a back that's had so many surgeries it's just about propped up with a buttress, and a complete lack of competitive action, the idea of Woods actually competing at the sharp end would appear preposterous. Then again, he likes to prove people wrong, observed McIlroy last week. Those of us who thought he was done and dusted, down and out, and dead and buried before his 2019 Masters win will reserve judgment. Given what state he was in last February, with his legs mangled and a gruelling rehabilitation in front of him, merely playing in the Masters will be a momentous triumph in itself. We await this latest twist in the tiger tale. This article was by Nick Rogers.
From The National of Tuesday the 5th of April 2022, from the comment section, UK's problematic Empire State due its day of reckoning, by Jerry Hassan. The UK is not in a good place, economically, socially, democratically, and this is about more than the obvious failings of Boris Johnson and this Tory government. This is clear to everyone outside of the Tory insider class. As people suffer hardship, anxiety and worry about the basics of life, Tory ministers boast that the UK is leading the world and finding its forte as an international leader for democracy in Ukraine by standing up to Putin's aggression. Such triumphalist rhetoric has been on the increase for the past few decades, gaining legitimacy in the aftermath of the Falklands War 40 years ago this month, when high Thatcherism began to get into its stride. This continued with the era of Blair and New Labour, then the Tories under Cameron, and now Johnson. Beyond the personalities of the leading figures of UK politics, it is seldom asked why this has happened and been allowed to happen. It should be asked because the answer goes to the heart of what the UK is, what it has been and is likely to be for the foreseeable future. The UK has never put the well-being and concerns of its people first and foremost, being what academics such as historian David Edgerton and democracy campaigner Anthony Barnett, along with myself, have called an empire state, has had profound consequences, not just internationally, but domestically. The British Empire State at first examination looks like it is about military projection, continual military intervention, and a reverence for Britain's past when it was a global imperial force. But it was also the mobilisation of society, resources and people to support this idea to the exclusion of the care of its citizens. The British Labour Party and the centre-left shied away from the nature of the British state and its impact on society, democracy and progress through their history. Thus, the historian Ian Cobain has found that the British Armed Forces have been actively involved in military action in every single year since 1914, maintaining, then dismantling empire, and then clinging to the wreckage. Tony Blair said to his advisers after the handover of Hong Kong sovereignty in 1997 to China, "We shouldn't lose any more territory. Britain needs to be big. Look at a map. Britain is so small." Boris Johnson has waxed lyrical several times, including during his time as Foreign Secretary, that the UK has been involved in, quotes, the invasion or conquest of 178 countries. That is most of the members of the UN, and that is because the UK is a warrior state. End of quotation. Yet this project and associated disinterest with the citizens of the UK reveals itself time and again in the contempt the political classes have for domestic concerns and policy. This empire state and its philosophy are present every day in Britain in ways so ubiquitous that they rarely attract comment. The City of London emerged as a major finance centre, divorced from the domestic economy to fund empire, colonial trade and slavery. To this day it does not support the UK economy, but engages in global trade, speculation and offshoring, which crowd out the needs of business here. A situation so entrenched, no Labour government has ever tried to change it. British citizenship is constructed as a racial entity with the mythology of empire and imperial citizenship only finally abolished in the Nationality Act of 1981, a law which ended the legal concept of colony and the British Empire, which ceased to exist in statute in January the 1st, 1983, the 40th anniversary of which is coming up. Underpinning all this is the survival of that feudal relic, the monarchy. This is not an apolitical institution, but the apex of the British state. And after the 70-year reign of the Queen, the wheels are coming off the institution. It is not just personalities. Andrew and his shameless behaviour, the continual excuses for the late Prince Philip's racism, sexism and bigotry, Prince Charles and his endless lobbying of government, and William and Kate's recent disastrous trip to the Caribbean. It is what it represents. William and Kate went to the Caribbean and could offer nothing but a couple of platitudes about empire and slavery while representing Britain's collective crimes. This brought forth terrible optics harking back to Britain's imperial past. But in Jamaica, Belize and the Bahamas, protests and the rising tide of republicanism showed countries that want to free themselves from the crown. Apart from the UK, only 14 states have the Queen as its head: Australia, New Zealand, Canada and various countries in the Caribbean. There is not one African or Asian state among them. This historical monarchy is in retreat and will soon be reduced to the UK alone, where it may not last that much longer. The legacy of empire and the empire state continue to shape Britain. There is the defence of what historian Caroline Elkins in Legacy of Violence calls legalised lawlessness. Not only that at home, it gave resonance to the populist racist language from Enoch Powell to Thatcher and Brexit. Elkins puts it, 50 years after Rivers of Blood Powellism is alive and well today, and how ideas of nation, sovereignty, purity of citizenship and British exceptionalism underwrite the Conservative Party's platform, tangling Brexit, the Empire, migrant workers stealing British jobs, and Britain's unique ability to go it alone. Robert Cooper, Tony Blair's foreign policy advisor, put it bluntly in the run-up to the Iraq War. The challenge to the postmodern world is to get used to the idea of double standards. Among ourselves, we operate on the basis of law and open cooperative security. But when dealing with more old-fashioned kinds of states outside the postmodern continent of Europe, we need to revert to the rougher methods of an earlier era: preemptive attack, deception, whatever is necessary. The nature of this empire state, its view of the world in the past and present, and its take on the UK domestically is problematic and selective. For all the triumphalist rhetoric with regard to the Ukraine and on the world stage, the end of this state of affairs, at home and abroad, would be a positive change for the people of the UK. Those places where the Queen is still head, the Commonwealth, and how the UK finds a global role which stands for democracy, solidarity and international law. Qualities the UK has sadly contributed to weakening over recent times and for a large part of its existence.
Recorded from the National on the 5th of April 2022, from the Culture section, London is the corner of a foreign land that is forever Scotland, by Robin McKelvey. There are times in London when the fact I'm from another country is unmistakable, and I feel, or am made to feel, a stranger in a foreign land. But when that happens, I always fall back on how thoroughly Scottish England's capital is, and gloriously so. Don't believe me, hop aboard now as we head south to the most Scottish city outside Scotland. I start in Scottish style with porridge aboard the Caledonian Sleeper at Euston, one of the brace of great Scottish rail termini on the Euston Road. It's too early to pop to Edinburgh Castle, a bizarrely spelled corner of Scotland in Camden. It dates back to the 19th century when the Scottish railway navvies had their own pub. It's a broad place on a sunny day with its big beer garden. Instead, I head to the British Library to doff my tartan bonnet at Edoardo Pelosi. One of Scotland's greatest sculptors crafted the hulking bronze statue of Sir Isaac Newton outside the British Library. I could keep things light heading to Baker Street to join Edinburgh's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle conjuring up the world's most famous fictional detective, and Paisley boy Jerry Rafferty penning his eponymous earworm, but Scotland's relationship with London has a darker side. I confront it on Caledonian Road. It's named after the Royal Caledonian Asylum, set up in 1815 to house Scottish kids orphaned during the Napoleonic Wars. The site today is now the Caledonian Estate, with the legacy of those young lives lingering in the thistles on the railings. The names of the housing blocks are steeped in Scotland too: Robert Burns, Sir William Wallace and Sir Walter Scott. We're getting religious now, walking south to Covent Garden and the Crown Court Church of Scotland, England's oldest Presbyterian church, with roots back to 1711. The stained glass windows feature both John Knox and Robert Burns. Down in Knightsbridge there is also St Columba's Church. The Blitz stood for the original 19th century church, with today's incarnation built in 1955. Pushing ever closer to that thoroughfare of Scottish commerce, the Thames, we come to Drummond's Bank opposite Nelson's Column on the square that is the unofficial London HQ of the Tartan Army. I've been known to forlornly insist a Scotsman founded the Bank of England when my Scottish notes are refused in London pubs. But I only learned about Drummond's recently. One of the UK's oldest banks was opened just after the 1715 Jacobite rebellion by Edinburgh man Andrew Drummond. Look out for the St Andrew's Cross and Pred Scottish signage. We're meeting the main man now, the poet whose statues adorn more countries than any other. There he is, thoughtfully watching over the Victoria Embankment Gardens. Sculpted by Aberdonian Sir John Steele, this Burns statue was unveiled in 1884 and today sits in the heart of a nation whose Burns felt Scotland's elites had sold their country to in exchange for gold. Cutting east, Scottish financial connections, both historic and contemporary, flow through London's financial quarter, and the ghosts of long-lost Scottish dockers drift in from the Thames. I can only be bound for one place, Smithfield. Our appointed Guardian of Scotland, Sir William Wallace, met his horrific end here on August 23, 1305. A simple memorial marks the baleful history at Sir Bartholomew's Hospital. After being hung, drawn and quartered, his head was symbolically stuck on London Bridge. That knowledge has forever changed Thames cruises for me. Delving once again through the darkness, I end my walk through history at the Tower of London. I could have finished at Westminster Abbey, where Mary Queen of Scots was belatedly recognised alongside fellow kings and queens a quarter of a century after her execution in 1587. To me it's more fitting not to pay tribute at her marble tomb, but the prison her cousin treacherously caged her in for 2 decades after she sought her for help. I'm down in London for 3 days and had only planned on this Scottish-themed walk one day, but my nation just keeps re-emerging and throwing up more questions as well as answers. I learn about Bruce's Castle and Haringey, and the London Scottish Golf Club on Wimbledon Common, England's oldest continuously played course, a real Victorian throwback. After I pass Scotland Yard, home of the Met to many, but for younger readers the secret entrance to the Ministry of Magic in Harry Potter, I ask Londoners about it. The original Great Scotland Yard lay elsewhere, but over my 3 days I don't meet anyone who knows the Scottish connection. Even at the 3 hotels I stay at, Scotland is never far away. Seeing my kilt at the reception at the plush Royal Lancaster, the manager tells me they once hosted Travis, and also a Scotland versus England boxing match here. At the Kipton Fitzroy, a grand old dame designed by the man who fashioned the Titanic's palatial dining room, I'm a stone throws away from the Elgin marbles and to those railway stations. I dine on Scottish salmon and a Scotch egg spiced with Duja sausage and black garlic. Surely there won't be any Scottish connections at the glitzy new Londoner on Leicester Square. Before Scottish lobster at dinner, I enjoy a Hendrick's at Joshua's Tavern. It's dedicated to painter Joshua Reynolds. One of his most famous portraits was of the Duke of Cumberland, the butcher of the Culloden infamy. In London, Scotland is never far away, no matter how foreign you feel. www.sleeper.scot, www.royallancaster.com, www.kimptonfitzroylondon.com, www.thelondoner.com. That article was by Robin McKelvey.
The National, April 7. Charity says late diagnosis affecting quality of life of Scots. Report by Jane MacLeod. Half of myeloma patients in Scotland have been left with life-altering conditions such as spinal fractures and kidney failure due to delayed diagnosis, a charity has found. Myeloma UK's report, A Life Worth Living, found half of patients received a late diagnosis, and 49% of patients living with the incurable blood cancer suffered a high impact on their quality of life because of missed diagnosis, while 34% experienced debilitating spinal fractures. The charity is now calling on the Scottish Government to make quality of life a key part of the upcoming cancer strategy. Sheila McKinlay, the charity's acting director of research and patient advisory, said the delays caused irreversible damage. About 457 people in Scotland are diagnosed with myeloma, which occurs in the bone marrow every year, and delayed diagnosis is more likely in younger patients. While it is one of the hardest cancers to diagnose, there are currently no targets or timeframes for myeloma to be caught early or within a reasonable amount of time, according to the charity. McKinlay said, "The quality of life of people living with myeloma has never been more important, with advances in treatment meaning that patients are able to live longer than ever before. Delayed diagnosis is well known to increase the likelihood that patients will experience 2 or more serious complications. Yet, there are still no specific diagnosis targets to make sure the disease is caught and treated in time and to tackle unacceptable and truly harmful delays. This is doubly unfair since we know outcomes for myeloma are already so poor. whether through severe and chronic pain, spinal fractures, kidney damage and other complications, myeloma patients are being condemned to a life of limitations because they were diagnosed far too late. With a cancer strategy on the horizon, now is the time to put quality of life at the heart of government policy. The Scottish Government urgently needs to develop targets that improve patients' experience and put the day-to-day lives of people with myeloma front and centre across research, policy development, commissioning and clinical practice. We cannot and will not allow people's lives to be diminished by avoidable delays in diagnosis. Sarah Barron from Falkirk had experienced debilitating lower back pain for over 6 weeks in July 2020 when she felt something snap in her back. A fluid-filled tumour had crushed one of her vertebrae, and Sarah was subsequently diagnosed with the blood disease and began radiotherapy and chemotherapy. Her first stem cell transplant was received successfully in July 2021. However, her second was met with delays because of the pandemic. Doctors told Sarah she should receive a second stem cell transplant 6 months after her first, but it was cancelled due to staff shortages and hospital pressure. Speaking of the disappointment, she said, "I cannot think about the second stem cell transplant because there's nothing I can do about the fact that you've lost that opportunity." Now keen to help Myeloma UK raise awareness of the impact delays in diagnosis can have on patients' quality of life, Sarah said there's a lack of standards with the cancer. She said, "Myeloma is not one of the big cancers, like breast cancer, but people should be diagnosed and treated as soon as possible. I really want to help Myeloma UK. I feel that the work they do is really important, and they're really saving people's lives." A Scottish Government spokesperson said, "The NHS remains under sustained pressure as a result of COVID-19, with the number of people awaiting diagnostic tests now at the highest level since 2018, and we are working tirelessly with health boards to provide vital services. Our stakeholders, like Myeloma UK, will be key in our engagement process to develop the next cancer strategy and early diagnosis vision. Preparations for our public consultation are currently underway and will be live shortly." Report by Jane MacLeod. The National, April 7. Greens say disconnected Chancellor turning off voters. Report by Hamish Morrison. Voters are being turned off the multi-millionaire Tory Chancellor because he is so utterly disconnected from reality, it has been claimed. New figures show Rishi Sunak, reported to be worth £200 million, has seen his approval ratings plunge as voters begin to feel the squeeze from the cost of living crisis he failed to tackle in his spring statement. His net favourability was down 24 points since just before his mini-budget on March 23 to reach minus 29, a survey by YouGov has found. He has no idea about the impact of his government's policies on ordinary households due to his massive personal wealth, the Scottish Greens have said. Sunak was granted permission in August last year to build a swimming pool, a gym and a tennis court in the grounds of his Grade 2 listed house mansion in his Yorkshire constituency. Prior to the cost of living crisis kicking in, pundits saw Sunak as a potential future Prime Minister, given his popularity with Tory voters. The poll put the Chancellor's support below that of Keir Starmer, minus 25, for the first time since the Labour leader took office. Minus 29 is Sunak's lowest ever result and is a 24-point decrease since March 22-23 and a 14-point drop since immediately after the spring statement, the figures showed. The poll found more than half of Britons, 57%, have an unfavourable opinion of the Chancellor, compared with 28% who view him in a positive light. And the Prime Minister has also seen a collapse in what remained of his approval ratings, which have fallen to minus 34, down 8 points from before the spring statement. Greens MSP Gillian Mackay said independence would allow Scots to get rid of cruel Tory politicians we did not vote for, inflicting hardship on our communities. She added, Rishi Sunak is so utterly disconnected from the reality that faces most ordinary people that it is no wonder he is so unpopular. He is the UK's wealthiest politician, and it is clear he has no idea about the impact his government's policies are having on communities across Scotland and the UK. In the last few months, Sunak has ripped £1,000 of universal credit payments from vulnerable households, raised the regressive national insurance tax, and presided over sky-high inflation. The government has refused to budge on scrapping the £20 per week cut to universal credit, despite warning the move would hit nearly 6 million people. The Chancellor has also stood by allowing energy bills go to a record 54% from April, and a 1.25 percentage point increase in the rate of national insurance contributions adds to the squeeze. The findings were based on a survey of 2,120 British adults on April 4 and 5, YouGov said. Report by Hamish Morrison. The National, April 7. George Galloway. Twitter claims ex-MP is Russian state-linked media. Report by Hamish Morrison. George Galloway has threatened to sue Twitter after he was labelled Russian state-affiliated media on the platform. The former Labour MP, who was famously ejected from the party over his staunch opposition to the Iraq War, hit out at the label on Wednesday evening. He currently hosts a show on the Russian state-backed TV station RT called Sputnik, which he has presented since 2013. Twitter has branded him as being linked with the Kremlin, but no reason has been provided for the label. Galloway strongly denies being associated with the Russian state. He tweeted, Dear Twitter support, I am not Russian state-affiliated media. I work for no Russian media. I have 400,000 followers. I am the leader of a British political party and spent nearly 30 years in the British Parliament. If you do not remove this designation, I will take legal action. In his most recent Sputnik episode, the Dundee-born unionist claimed that Russia's currency has recovered from Western sanctions. The ruble crashed in the days following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but has recovered, though not to its pre-invasion levels. Twitter's rules around the labels mean state-financed media outlets in the West, which are editorially independent of the government, such as the BBC or NPR in the United States, are not branded as state-affiliated. But outlets such as RT, formerly Russia Today, and the Chinese government-backed Global Times newspaper are. Twitter defines state-affiliated media as outlets where the state exercises control over editorial content through financial resources, direct or indirect political pressures, and or control over production and distribution. Also included in the warning label are prominent staff. Galloway's weekly show is produced by Global Media Services, a commercial subsidiary of the international media group, the Associated Press. Since he was expelled from the Labour Party in 2003, after he called on British soldiers in Iraq to disobey their illegal orders, he has led 3 minor political parties, including All for Unity, which oppose Scottish independence. He is currently the leader of the Workers' Party of Britain and most recently held office as the MP for Bradford West between 2012 and 2015. Twitter was approached for comment. Report by Hamish Morrison.
From The National, Thursday the 7th of April 2022, from the sports section. Ange Postecoglou Celtic staff model hailed as ex-Rangers boss praises backroom team, by David Irvin. Ange Postecoglou's decision to keep the Celtic backroom he inherited at Lennoxtown has been hailed by former rival boss Alex McLeish. The ex-Rangers boss insisted the backroom staff at Celtic have been a coup for Postecoglou, who came into his Celtic on his own from Japan. Postecoglou previously revealed he had never travelled with his own backroom team when moving job, and for McLeish, his methods have paid off at Celtic. Hailing Gordon Strachan and John Kennedy's experience in Scottish football, McLeish told Football Insider, "Sometimes you keep on staff you've inherited. You go further forward in your years and you think, did I get that right or did I get that wrong?" Regardless of the situation, there's no doubt about it that Postecoglou got it right. He's seen the intelligence of guys like Gavin Strachan and also John Kennedy, the experience he's had at Celtic. Gavin has been there for a while as well. It would seem daft to throw that experience out the door. Postecoglou would also have his own guys to lean on as well, but inheriting them and continuing their knowledge of Celtic, I think that's been a bit of a coup for him. Revealing his philosophy when it comes to backroom staff, Postecoglou previously told, "I haven't done it my whole career. Everywhere I've gone, I've always worked with different people or taken new people, not people I've worked with before. It just depends on your personality. My thing is that I enjoy the challenge of convincing people to my way of playing the game. I could take a crew of people around with me, and I reckon that, for my personality, would make me comfortable and probably a bit lazy. I could just roll up here, get them to take the training sections, but from the first day I rolled up here, there's some really bright guys in the building. And I had to say to them, look, we are going to do things this way, and I'll tell you why, and I'll explain it to you why, and I'll get you to believe in it. That keeps me sharp. That keeps me constantly always making sure that my message is super clear, so I love that challenge. I love the fact that I walked in here from the other side of the world, literally, just by myself, and before I convinced anyone else, I had to convince the people in the building that I was the right person for the job." That article was by David Irvin.
From The National of Thursday the 7th of April 2022, from the comment section, "The Real Scottish Politics. Tories get basics wrong again on Channel 4." By The Duker. The wee ginger Doug is off this week, so the Duker will be filling in. Channel 4 has over the years exposed its fair share of Tories and is now doing so again, but this time without having to put in any investigative effort at all. That's because in their rush to privatise the channel, the Conservative Party seem to be steadfast in their desire to make basic factual errors. The most recent gaffe has us reflecting on a classic from Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries too. First up, Ben Bradley is the privately educated chairman of the Working Class Blue Collar Conservatives group. On Tory plans to privatise Channel 4, the Mansfield MP wrote, "Welcome this. The state doesn't need to be owning media. It made sense once when we had a handful of channels, but now we have a million choices. Channel 4 can't raise any of its own money, which holds it back. The pounds end up being from the taxpayer. Let it free and it will compete." This is, of course, nonsense. The broadcaster had a record surplus last year, can raise its own funds, and does not take a penny from the public purse. So he tried again, deleting his tweet and writing, "Welcome this. If Channel 4 wants to compete in the modern market, it needs to be able to invest and grow. It can't do that unless it is free from the state. Taxpayers can't fund that, so it needs to be a private business. No need for state involvement anymore." The Tory desire for Channel 4 to compete in the modern market translates to stop reporting the facts on how disastrous Brexit has been and the cost of living crisis that our UK government has created. The party is so spiteful that you would hardly be surprised if it turned out the privatisation was revenge purely for Dorries being left red-faced during a session of the Commons Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee in November last year. Asked about the future of Channel 4, she said, "I would argue that to say that just because Channel 4 has been established as a public service broadcaster and just because it is in receipt of public money, we should never kind of audit the future of Channel 4 and we should never evaluate how Channel 4 looks in the future and whether or not it's a sustainable and valuable model. It's quite right that the government should do that." Again, Channel 4 is not funded by the state. Conservative MP Damien Green was kind enough to point that out to Dorries at the time, but you can imagine how many of her fellow MPs, just like Bradley, have no clue about how any of this actually works. And this is the quality of minister that's being in the union inflicts upon us. A vote for the union is a vote for a culture secretary who does not understand even the most basic principles of one of the nation's foremost news channels. In light of that, it's yet another example of Scottish Labour's negligence in refusing to allow candidates who support even holding IndyRef to stand for election. This article was by the Duker.
And that was this week's The National podcast, normally recorded in our studio at the Bishopbriggs Media Centre, currently recorded from our volunteers' homes with the publisher's kind permission. Thanks for listening.